It's Wednesday, November 13th. I'm Matt Harmon. Welcome to the Yahoo Fantasy Forecast. It is a hell of a day to talk ball, and join me to do just that is Sal Vetri. Sal, what's going on, buddy?
What's up, man? Yeah, week 11's on the horizon. Honestly, a lot of the work has been done. Like, there's trade deadlines coming and going probably around this week for most people. A lot of fab budgets have been spent, so you kind of know what your team is looking like. You kind of stuck with that team in some situations, and the fantasy playoffs are quickly approaching.
The fantasy playoffs are quickly approaching. I'll just throw this to you here real quick because, as you mentioned, like public leagues on Yahoo, the trade deadline is this week. This is the time. This is the moment. One, because I know most of your content has to do with kind of buying and selling and trades and stock up, stock down. You're one of the best at that. So first of all, is this like a real sigh of relief week for you where you feel like a big burden comes off your shoulders? And two, how do you advise people sort of just a general sense, how do you advise people sort of approach the trade deadline?
Yeah, my workload definitely drops by probably like 25 to 30%. So it's almost like a mini vacation, if you will, in terms of just some leisure time opening up. But yeah, this time of year, trade deadline, you have to know what your roster needs. Like, is it an immediate fix just to try and get to the postseason? Or do you feel pretty good about your chances of making it there? Maybe you're already securing a spot in the playoffs if you only have 1-2 losses. And then you're looking ahead into like week 15, 16. What do some of those matchups look like? So it's sort of a balancing act. And for the most part, I'm trying to see rest of season what these players look like instead of just the next 1 to 2 weeks. Of course, factor in bye week still. There's still teams with byes going into week 12. I think, heck, all the way to week 14. So understand that when you're trading for a player, if you're somebody that has to still make a push for the postseason. But yeah, I mean, it's urgency time, right? The trade deadline's here. It's going to create more trades in your leagues, even if your league isn't one that makes trades. People need to improve their rosters, and this is the week to do so.
Absolutely. I love this time of year. Once the trade deadlines pass, once Thanksgiving passes, we start to get into sort of stash season for fantasy football. You know, the one injury away type of guys. There's every year I say it, there's some random, usually running back, that's going to probably win people fantasy championships. Sometimes it's a rookie wide receiver. You know, it was Amon-Ra St. Brown a few years ago, who at this point of the season was just kind of starting to get ramped up. I don't know that I have like a this year's Amon-Ra St. Brown. I don't know that I have a this year's, rookie or just running back that's going to win people fantasy championships, but that player is out there. I don't know if we're going to identify that player, Sal. It'd be great if we could at some point, but that's just the way fantasy works. There's always some random hero that we're not even talking about right now who's probably going to be a big part of the proceedings in week 15, 16, 17 that hands people fantasy championships. So again, I love this time of year. I love this type of analysis. So it's a good time to be alive.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of those situations, it's either an injury that causes it, so you couldn't really see it coming, or for people who do play in deeper leagues, especially dynasty leagues, maybe it's just one of these later round rookies. Like, we've already seen it with the Tyron Tracy type, but maybe there's another one of those players that just gets some more opportunities if their team's completely out of it. If it's just maybe, you don't want to say a tanking team, but they have nothing to play for, get the younger guys on the field, and that's when those guys can really start to break out. So yeah, stashing after this week when the trade deadline's over starts to become a priority.
All right, like I said, we might not identify any of these players on this podcast, but we do have a lot to talk about here. You know how this works. Welcome to the week 11 data dump.
Yes, science.
My calculations are correct. You're going to see some serious.
Now here's how this goes for the new people out there. For the Sal fans who just decided to check into this podcast this week because they know the trade deadline is this week and they got to hear who's Sal, the moves to make at the end of the show. We'll get to Sal's moves to make at the end of the show, but before we do that, each of us bring 5 stats that you need to know to the table here in the data dump. We have a secret stat at the end where Sal's going to try to guess my secret stat player. I'm going to try to guess his. I think I've got a pretty good. I actually have a lot of guesses as to who Sal's secret stat is. Just looking at the notes on the outline, but we'll get to all that. Sal, you start us off here. What is your first stat-based storyline that people need to know heading into week 11?
Yeah, it's the 49ers passing game usage out of the bye week. And really, this is the first game since Brandon Ayuk went down, which was like a month ago at this point, that we actually saw all these passing game weapons active. And that's not even factoring in Christian McCaffrey, who came back, saw 7 targets. But in terms of the usage, we got Juwan Jennings back from an injury out of the bye. 95% of the routes, led the team with 11 targets. Deebo Samuel, 83% of the routes and 6 targets. And there's McCaffrey, 79% of the routes and 7 targets. Kittle, 74% of the routes, 4 targets. And then Ricky Pearsall runs 71% of the routes, the rookie, and 6 targets. There's a lot of takeaways you can go here, honestly, for like every single one of these players. But the thing that stands out to me is Juwan Jennings. And I think it should stand out for most people because not only was he finally healthy and we finally got to see him in a game since Brandon Ayuk got injured and what that usage would be, it was great usage. Like, he was lining up as an X receiver. He was playing, for the most part in this game, the Brandon Ayuk role, which is not something we've seen often in the past. One, because Ayuk's just been healthy, but even when he fills in for that role, it's not really just X receiver, go out and win. And he won. He had nearly 100 yards. He had 11 targets. If Brock Purdy doesn't miss him on a short crossing route, he goes over 100 yards. And I think this is something that is probably sticky moving forward. Now, Deebo will have his blow-up games. Kittle will earn more than 4 targets in games moving forward. So I don't think Jennings is going to be a lock and load 10-plus target guy. But I think this is pretty serious. Like, I think I'm looking at it right now as this is probably a top 24 receiver most weeks, especially with the buys moving forward. And I don't know if I'm just crazy.
No, I don't think you're crazy. Maybe top 24 is tough, but I do think he's in that kind of range. You mentioned it that we've never seen Jennings play in this X receiver role. I talked about that a lot with Andy on the Sunday recap. I mean, even when Jennings had that big game in week 3 against the Rams, 11 catches, 175 yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns, he was in the slot on 46% of his snaps. And that's kind of the role we've usually seen Juwan Jennings play in, is as a role player, a big slot for this 49ers team, sort of the power slot guy, because he's the blocker, he's that third down menace. But Sal, as I noted on Sunday, it makes sense that Jennings would thrive in this X receiver role because you think about third down plays, that's when man coverage goes up. That's when on critical down and distances, you always see zone coverage rates fall. You see man coverage rates come up. And if you're going to play as the X receiver, you have to win in on these ISO routes, these one-on-one coverage situations. That's what we saw Juwan Jennings do on Sunday, primarily on outbreaking routes, which has always been his specialty when he's playing as that slot receiver. So different type of route tree than Brandon Ayuk, different type of player than Brandon Ayuk, but it makes sense that he can step into this X receiver role and give them something different. I like your call on Juwan Jennings here. I think he's somebody that, until we see different usage, probably is somebody that's going to be making starting lineups. Before we talk about some of the other receivers in this passing game, I do just want to note, as I said on Sunday, I want to see this against somebody other than the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which is probably like a bottom 3 pass defense. But then again, Sal, week 11, we get the Seattle Seahawks, who are coming off their bye, so we'll see what their defense looks like. But that has certainly been a secondary that's been a little volatile as well. Yeah,
definitely. I want to see it moving forward as well in different matchups. But there's other takeaways, like Ricky Pearsall, what his usage was coming out of the bye. I thought it was encouraging. I mean, gets the deep touchdown that kind of really just propelled his week forward, 70 plus yards in back-to-back games for him. But I'll try and weave in some more like maybe trade discussions because of the deadline here, and then we'll address specific guys later on. But Deebo Samuel to me is somebody that maybe is a sell candidate right now. Now, this is like a somewhat you're selling low on Deebo. Like, he had a fine game here. He goes for like 60 total yards, has a couple of carries in the game, or 70 total yards. It was a fine game. Like, he's probably still working his way back from multiple different injuries that he's been dealing with. And we know he'll have those blow up weeks. He's an elite talent, excellent player, nothing bad to say about him. But if McCaffrey's back, if Kittle continues to have the strong year he's having, and if Jennings and Pearsall are going to be involved, if you can dish Deebo, especially based on name value, especially because people know Brandon Ayuk's done for the year, so thinking about a larger role for him, you get Josh Jacobs plus somebody else if you need an upgrade at a different position with the trade deadline coming up. It's something that I have Deebo in about 2 leagues right now that I seriously care about, and I'm trying to see what I'm just testing the market right now, what I can get in return for him.
I like this call because I was updating my rest of season rankings this morning, and I didn't really know what to do with Deebo. Because you mentioned it, like he's Deebo Samuel, and typically when your analysis starts with he's this player, it sucks. So I know I just said that, but that's generally the way it goes. And it's just tough because, again, a lot of name value, which can be good on the trade market. At the same time, you just look at the way this passing game has split up in recent weeks. It's not as if like, okay, Ayuk is down and Deebo just inherits all of the volume. Some of that, like you said, it could be due to injury. He's been targeted on 21.3% of his routes since week 7. Where Ayuk obviously was hurt in week 7 after just 16 routes. We haven't necessarily seen those big eruption games from him. And that makes sense because like Debo's probably not their future at the wide receiver position. I know the 49ers are trying to win the Super Bowl this year. They're not like in the middle of the season thinking about their future, but they extended Jawan Jennings prior to the year. They extended Brandon Ayuk. Obviously, he's coming off a serious injury, but he is somebody that will be part of their future. And Ricky Pearsall is a first-round pick, and I like that you called out Ricky Pearsall as well, too, because I think he's looked fantastic the last couple of weeks, especially this game coming off the bye. I thought he looked really good. Again, it's the Bucs, I get it, but still, you just wonder if the way that we typically think of this Niners offense, where it's Debo and Ayuk and Kittle and McCaffrey, it's probably not going to look like that in the future. And it might behoove them to not just funnel everything through Samuel, especially because he's a guy they want to keep healthy at this point.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially heading into the postseason, which is something that they're trying to push for right now. So that's just kind of the takeaways that I have from this. Jennings is somebody that, especially if you were able to buy this guy when he was in his bye week, when he was banged up the last couple of weeks, you probably can get him super cheap. He's the guy who's just rising up, at least for me, my rest of season rankings the most right now.
All right, let's go to your second storyline here, which is on Calvin Ridley. And he's a player that Dalton and I, just on yesterday's pod, took out of the coping corner. Probably a little bit overdue, but it was definitely time.
Yeah, I mean, I can't blame you. Like, you were waiting for Will Levis to come back and see what happens, and you got more production with Will Levis back in the lineup this past week. And now it's been 3 games for Ridley since DeAndre Hopkins was traded to the Chiefs, and during that time, with 2 different quarterbacks, Mason Rudolph and Will Levis, not the greatest quarterbacks, still Ridley has ran 93% of the routes, earned 10.7 targets per game, nearly a 40% target share, and he's averaging about 20 fantasy points per game, depending on if it's half PPR for you, which includes 2 top 5 finishes during that stretch. So he's been great. Now, obviously, the target volume going up without Hopkins, and like Nick Westbrook has been your biggest target competition, or Tyler Boyd, someone in the slot. Like, it's going to be easier to earn targets. There was a bit of a squeaky wheel narrative there when he was frustrated about a month ago as well. But also the usage is changing somewhat. It is a small sample of just 3 games compared to the whole season. But earlier this year, we were constantly seeing average depth of targets in games of 20, upwards of 26 yards in some games. I mean, you're just looking at hard to complete passes for the most part. And if you complete some, it's probably not a lot. But more recently, these have been coming down. You're looking at games the last 3 weeks of 12.4 average depth of target, 15 and 16.1. Just easier targets to complete for more consistency, but also still has some upside to those. So this past week was a perfect example. You get the 41-yard touchdown, but you also get his first target of the game for 11 yards on an in-breaking route or on a screen. You get later in the game in the third quarter, first play, 1st and 10, a comeback route for about 12 yards. Like, these were not the things we were seeing week 1 and week 2 all that often. So it's nice that they're being, just getting more of a floor to the usage that we're seeing, with the ceiling still being there. Now, of course, it's still Will Levis. It's still this Titans offense, but that hasn't been a problem the last 3 weeks. And when you look ahead to the playoff schedule, and this is the big thing here, like, Calvin Ridley is going to be hard to trade for. You're probably going to have to overpay at this point. But if somebody's trying to sell high on him and there's a fair deal out there, the playoff schedule is the reason to be buying him despite the poor quarterback play. You're looking at the Commanders, the Jaguars twice heading into the postseason and in the postseason for fantasy, and the matchups against the Bengals and Colts. So this end of year plus fantasy playoff schedule has me buying into what we're seeing out of Ridley the past month.
Yeah, that playoff schedule that you mentioned is really good. I will say that if you do have Calvin Ridley, if you buy Calvin Ridley, you might have to deal with some rocky play here the next couple of weeks. Week 11, Minnesota Vikings. Obviously, they have put bad quarterbacks in a blender over and over again. I think Will Levis still qualifies as somebody that they can do that to. Week 12 against the Texans. That's a bit of a tougher defense to go against. Even Washington in week 13, they've been trending up from a defensive perspective as well. So you might have to deal with, look, I still think you're going to have to accept some volatility with Ridley, but the usage that you point out here, getting a lot of those gimme targets, the designs, even some screens and things like that, that really is going to help boost up the floor, that it's not 20 points or literally 0 points, which we've seen from Ridley at least once this year. So I like Ridley right now. Just kind of give me a ballpark range where you'd maybe rank him rest of season, some guys that he's around, just so people get kind of a hard and fast. This is where I want to value him rest of the way.
Yeah, I have Ridley right now ranked right around guys like Ladd McConkey, Darnell Mooney, Josh Downs. That's the range at the wide receiver position. Rest of season across different positions, I have guys like Brian Robinson in there. Also Tank Dell, wide receiver, Tony Pollard.
All right, yeah, we're pretty much in the same kind of ballpark there. I definitely would rather have those running backs for sure. Just the running backs right now have been more stable, more productive as those flex plays than wide receivers. But at the same time, that is generally the group at wide receiver that I have him around as well. All right, let's go to your third storyline here, which is a rookie running back on the rise.
Yeah, the Broncos backfield I want to check in here, and this is one of the biggest just fantasy headlines in general coming out of this past week in Week 10. Audric Estime, their late-round rookie out of Notre Dame. We got reports last week from Sean Payton himself after the game on Sunday that Estime would be more involved. He was answering a question on that, and we kind of got it in Week 11. 45% of the snaps. He saw 14 carries. Javonte Williams, 29% of the snaps, just 1 carry, and Jaleel McLaughlin starts the game, sees a carry, but then only sees 1 carry the rest of the game. So a couple of things here is, one, it's good that we got some news from the coach and then it actually came through and it paid off in a pretty decent way in terms of usage. 14 of 17 backfield carries, 82% for Estime, easily the best usage he's seen all season. Some of the best usage in terms of backfield share carries that any running back has seen on the Broncos this year. And, he was decent on them early on in the game. I think that maybe played into it. He had like a bunch of just 5-yard carries in a row. He had an 8-yard carry on his first touch, which I think is something that maybe just gave him more opportunity going forward in that one. So, one, I think this is good. He's probably now picked up on waivers by the time that you're hearing this, especially because the waiver wire for running backs the past month has been absolutely brutal in fantasy land. But I'm a little bit skeptical of this just because it is still Sean Payton. I do think he likes Estime. Estime was great in college. He kind of fell a little bit maybe because of his 40 time, which was here or there. It's not really the way that he wins anyways in between the tackles, a power runner. But there's still 3 running backs involved. There's still 3 running backs who kind of have just totally different roles in this offense involved. Like, I think you're still going to see McLaughlin in on some 2-minute drills and just really change of pace type stuff. I think they're not going to completely get rid of Javonte Williams, even if his role is reduced to 30% of the snaps. That's 30% of the snaps that another running back is out there for. And Estime's almost a 0 in the passing game. I mean, he ran 7 routes in this one. I think he can probably add a target or 2 here or there, but for the most part, you're probably looking most weeks with a mobile quarterback in the backfield and Bo Nix, who will run in the red zone. You're hoping for these 12 to 14 carry games, and if he doesn't find the end zone, like, the upside is tough here. I guess the uncapped or unknown potential for what he could be if he's just a dude is the reason you go and you stash him moving forward. But I think this one might be getting a little bit blown out of proportion, but I'm curious to see your thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a risk that it could get blown out of proportion. He's a guy that absolutely should be added. We do this sometimes in fantasy, the shiny new toy, the new thing on the block or whatever. We get obsessed with like these running backs. And like I said, there's always one running back that we haven't really considered for the course of the season that becomes a fantasy difference maker. And I mean, shoot, it could be Audric Estime. The Broncos go on bye in week 14, but then they come back, they play the Colts. That's a pretty decent matchup against the run. The Chargers, obviously a tougher one, but I mean, shoot, they got the Bengals in week 17. Could Audric Estime, in a game where the Denver Broncos defense puts Joe Burrow in a blender and they're controlling it on the other side of the ground, and Estime pops in 2 touchdowns, he gets 20 carries because at that point he's the running back for Denver. Yeah, there's probably a universe where that exists, but I did say a lot of ifs there. And we're also talking about week 17. We still got a long way to go until we get to week 17. We have no idea what that's going to look like. But at the same time, I think he's worth discussing and worth considering. There's a chance, like I said, this gets blown out of proportion. What do you want to do with him, though, in week 11? Because I will say, pretty good matchup here against the Falcons, who rank 28th in rushing success rate allowed. He does look like he's taking over as the early down banger. But I don't know. Give me a percentage on this, Sal. What's the likelihood that fantasy Twitter yaps about Audric Estime all week long? We get to the point where analysts are trying to one-up each other. It goes from, probably good add off the waiver wire to, by the time Sunday rolls around, people are like, you got to start Audric Estime. High scoring game against the Falcons, 28th in rushing success rate. And then, like, what are the odds we get a rug pull here in week 11 with Audric Estime?
Yeah, probably pretty high is my guess. Like, I mean, earlier this season, Sean Payton was saying the exact same things about Javonte Williams. Last season and all offseason, he was saying the exact same things about Jaleel McLaughlin. It's just kind of like what he's feeling. I think some of these are just quotes or questions that he's answering that kind of get a little bit blown out of proportion as well. He doesn't really have too much, you can say, vigor behind some of the things that he's saying as opposed to just answering questions. So, yeah, I mean, like, to compare it, if this is a flex option for some people, of course, if you're in a really bad spot, some more bye weeks going on, Bucky Irving's on bye, Rashad White, sure, like, I'd start him over Gus Edwards if, like, that's another option that you have this week for guys that are probably touchdown or busts. But, like, Browns guys coming out of the bye, I'll start Elijah Moore, I'll start Jerry Jeudy over them. Like, I think there's just so many other receivers that I'd rather be starting over Estime, who I think 45% of the snaps is great to see, but I just struggle to see how it gets much higher than that unless they seriously go all in on him, which if he's seeing 60 to 70%, he's probably still just seeing 14 or 15 carries. So at that point, touchdown or bust player, I'd rather have these wide receivers who are still earning 6, 7, 8 targets.
Yeah, look, I'm kind of in the same range here in that I'd like to see another prove it week of him atop the depth chart and as the top running back here, because Sean Payton does have a bit of a wandering eye, and even they have been trying to give Javonte Williams some competition for quite some time. So that part of it I do believe. The part of it I'm skeptical about is that Audric Estime is just the clear-cut running back one here and that he's a fantasy starter. But look, if we see really good usage again in week 11 and maybe you miss out on a big fantasy performance, it happens on your bench, well, guess what? They get the Raiders in week 12. And I think that's another really good matchup for Estime where maybe you can start him in that one. All right, let's get to your fourth storyline here, which is, oh my God, what does the Jaguars target tree look like with Mac Jones under center?
Yeah, Mac Jones got the start with Trevor Lawrence out, dealing with a shoulder issue that seems like we're kind of really just waiting on reports on this. It seems like it could be pretty serious or at least require a surgery that could shut him down for the year. It's been compared to on Twitter by some doctors and physical therapists, the same thing that Anthony Richardson dealt with last year. So we'll see what actually comes out from this once we get better reports. As of right now, he's uncertain for week 11, which doesn't sound great. So we might be getting another week of Mac Jones. And if that's the case, we should probably look into who he was targeting, who was benefiting from Mac Jones in week 10. Well, you see right from the start, Evan Ingram leads the way with a 38% target share at the tight end. Brian Thomas just a 14% target share. Gabe Davis 19%. And then the only other player above 10% was another tight end, Brenton Strange, at 14%. My takeaways here are a couple things. First, I don't think Brian Thomas is right just by watching this game, like health-wise. But two, it was a tough matchup to just get thrown into in this one against the Minnesota Vikings. Like, that's tough for anybody. Mac Jones only throws for 111 yards. I think there'll be better outputs, especially maybe week 11 in terms of, 150 to 200 yard performances, some upside there for a little bit more for everybody in this pie. But Brian Thomas is just not a fit for what Mac Jones has done in his career, dating back to college, and definitely right now behind the Jaguars offensive line. So I'm concerned about Brian Thomas. He's like one of the guys who dropped down my rankings the most this past week for rest of season stuff. I wouldn't consider him a buy low as of right now. But Evan Ingram is somebody that I'm trying to buy low on. Evan Ingram, 38% target share in this game. Where he wins is in the middle of the field, short targets. His average depth of target this year is like 6 yards, which does work with Mac Jones. He's often put in motion. He's often used as a receiver in the slot for this team. And since he returned from his injury, these last 5 games, 30% target share, has led the team in targets every single week. And Christian Kirk's now done. Middle of the field competition for targets is gone. The last 2 weeks without Christian Kirk, you're seeing a 34% and 38% target share for Ingram. The upside on this offense with Mac Jones behind it is not great rest of season, but if there's somebody before your trade deadline, tight end position, if you're still struggling there, that you can get some upside out of, I would say Evan Ingram to me is somebody that I am trying to go ahead and buy in some leagues.
Man, it is amazing how this Jaguars coaching staff just designs the whole offense out of Evan Ingram, who's, he's a fine enough player. But my God, and I get it, that Christian Kirk's not here, the whole deal. Parker Washington's not stepping up as a target earner, but still, like all those points you mentioned about how often he's in motion, he's the designed target player on certain plays. It's pretty wild. But yeah, I think unfortunately I'm with you on most of your analysis with Brian Thomas here. I'm almost kind of glad that he's gonna maybe like the steam's gonna come down on him, because I think that will probably give us more of a fair evaluation of where he is as a player, where I think, I've said a lot on the pod that I think people got a little over their skis, especially in like dynasty circles. I think he's probably going to settle maybe a little bit more where he probably should be at this point from a dynasty standpoint, and not like get into the top 5 of dynasty receivers and stuff like that. I'm not quite sure he's there as a player, but yeah, for the most part, I just think he's not healthy and he's dealing with Mac Jones as his quarterback. So you mentioned that, okay, you dropped him down your rest of season rankings. Give me again, kind of ballpark it for people, like who are some names that he's around, and you can go in position, out of position, whatever you want.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up right now. I have Brian Thomas currently as my 57th player overall. He's behind guys like Darnell Mooney at the position. Across different positions, he's behind guys like Tyron Tracy, DeAndre Swift, also behind T. Higgins, DeAndre Hopkins. Where he sits ahead of are players like just ahead of, in the same tier, Josh Downs, Jalen Waddle, Amari Cooper, across different positions, Brian Robinson, Rashad White.
Man, yeah, you went even tougher than me in terms of like where you dropped him rest of season wise. But I think he's probably still like a wide receiver 3 that you start and just kind of cross your fingers in certain spots because he does still have that weekly upside. I think we need to reckon with just how many of these wide receivers are volatile from a week to week basis. I mean, people like Devontae Smith is going to be up and down for you. Zay Flowers is going to be up and down for you. We've seen that. Like we've seen that more than enough times at this point already. I think, and those are guys that are probably still every week starters for people just with the way the position has kind of fallen apart from an injury standpoint. These guys are going to end up being there. But yeah, I mean, Brian Thomas, as of now, he still has a 19% target share on the year. He's not even crossed 20%. He hasn't had double digit targets in any game this year. And is Mac Jones going to be the guy that funnels 30% of the targets to him? I don't think so, especially because where Thomas wins, they get him some manufactured stuff underneath and let him run after the catch. And I mean, Mac Jones can do that. That was Mac Jones' specialty at Alabama, was getting the ball out quick and setting up yards after catch opportunities for some of these speedy receivers. But all of those downfield shot plays that Trevor Lawrence is hitting, that's not coming back here. So I think the ceiling has been dramatically depressed, and just given with what we've seen from the usage, like the floor was really not totally safe anyways, and it definitely is not safe at this point.
Yeah, my biggest drop for sure. He was probably like around the mid-30s overall players rest of season for me. So he dropped about 20 to 30 spots. And this is assuming Trevor Lawrence does miss more than just this upcoming week, and it's going to be something that could end his season. Because if that's the case, I mean, he's coming off of a season-low 3-target game. I don't think that could... That's not going to happen every single week moving forward, even if Lawrence isn't out there. But it's just hard for me to also trust the Jaguars coaching staff and the guys that are behind this offense. So that's like just everywhere I look, I'm kind of like, oh, this kind of sucks.
Yeah, well, that's just because you don't understand the plays, Sal Vetri. Doug Peterson gets it, you don't get it. So let's just remember that. Yeah, I think if we got news that Trevor Lawrence was, he's having surgery, he's out for the year, I think I'd probably drop Brian Thomas further. So you're probably just a little bit ahead of the game on that one. All right, let's get to it. The fifth stat that people need to know, and our secret stat here for you, Sal Vetri. Hit me with it.
Yeah, new wide receiver 1 is emerging in fantasy land over the past month. This wide receiver ranks 6th in fantasy points per game, ahead of guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson, Drake London, all first to early second round picks this past summer. This receiver that I'm talking about is top 10 in explosive plays this season, but over the past month, he ranks first in this category. That was before Monday Night Football, but I'm assuming it's still going to keep up. And he's seen a 27% target share the past month, 50% more targets than anybody else on his team. He basically has just no competition for targets. He's dominating with explosive plays, and it's leading to a lot of production the past month to where you feel strong. He's winning you weeks in your lineup. I have a thing that I call cheat code targets. You can call them whatever you want. They're the combination of targets that are deep targets, 20 plus yards downfield, and red zone targets. I call them cheat codes because if you get a couple of these in a game consistently, usually it leads to some of these explosive plays or big box score totals for fantasy, touchdowns and 20 plus yard receptions. This player has 26 of those on the season, and you should continue to see more moving forward just with the offense he's in. That's 4th amongst all players. I mean, that's in the range of what like DK Metcalf is doing year to year, the way that we think about him, both in the red zone and downfield. So this player for the rest of the season, you're probably not going to be able to acquire him in trades. I don't know why anybody would want to trade him away, but he's going to get to face 5 bottom 10 secondaries over the next 6 games, according to NFL Pro. So Matt Harmon, who is this secret player behind these stats?
I have a few guesses, but my first guess is George Pickens.
You are correct. It is indeed George Pickens.
Had a good feeling about that one.
I thought that would, I didn't want to say anything about quarterbacks or like new quarterbacks since this quarterback came over, but I did think there was like, 2, 3, 4 guys that it could have been, but Pickens, I assumed you would get it just based on some of the explosive number stuff.
The explosive numbers is what got me. The other one that I thought about was maybe Cedric Tillman. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, it was, I thought that we'd have a pretty good guess here in George Pickens, just because, man, I think you were at a disadvantage in terms of me. Not that there's any reward to you fooling me or anything. I actually don't know if either one of us has fooled the other at this point since we've been doing this. I think
we'll see in about 2 minutes.
Yeah, we'll see. Although I think mine might be kind of easy to get, but regardless, I think that the reason that I kind of got this and you're at a bit of a disadvantage here is that I've been weirdly fascinated with this Steelers offense since Russell Wilson has taken over. So I've done a lot of digging into it. And yeah, these explosive plays have really been, just been central to this attack. And it's such a good fit between quarterback, receiver, and the way this team wants to play. You mentioned the upcoming schedule, which we've highlighted too, is really good for this type of wide receiver, especially. I mean, the Ravens matchup this week is pretty electric. I don't know that George Pickens is a guy that you can trade for at this point, but I'll give it a redraft take. I'll give a dynasty take here on George Pickens. I'll go dynasty first. That at the beginning of the year, I thought he was just one of the best buys in dynasty because he was playing so well on film. Like his separation has always been something that's like a little bit of a negative of his game. Not as bad as some people people act like he's like DJ Chark or something from a separation standpoint. He's not quite that, but he also isn't quite he hasn't always been a consistently good above average separator. At the beginning of this year, he was doing that. He was putting that on tape. It just wasn't always coming through in the box score. Then he goes through this kind of weird period of the year where I was like, am I going to regret making this guy kind of a big time buy in dynasty because his effort is once again waning. We're in kind of a weird stage with the Justin Fields stuff. But man, ever since Russell Wilson's got under center, I'm feeling pretty good about saying he was a guy to buy in dynasty because he's got a quarterback that's using him the exact right way. Love all the explosive stuff that you highlight here. And from a redraft standpoint, like, I don't know. We talked about a guy like Deebo Samuel. You mentioned DK Metcalf. Like, I think George Pickens is in that ballpark with those guys. And, in a couple, with some of these matchups coming up, I might rather have a guy like George Pickens than some of those bigger names.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think so, too. I think I have him right now as a top 40 player overall rest of the season. We redrafted today. He'd be a third or a fourth round pick for me in drafts. I have him ahead of Marvin Harrison, Jaden Reed, Mike Evans, who could be coming back from an injury, Devontae Adams. I think he's a tier above those guys right now, right around like the Devonta Smith range, which, I mean, those are third round picks from this past summer. I think he's playing that well. And the fantasy season is just so long because I remember thinking about a trade that came in one of the leagues I care about. This was back when Andy Dalton was just dealing with Deontay Johnson. And I got George Pickens plus an asset. It might have been Rachaad White at the time when both of those guys were just completely struggling. Nobody wanted them. Deontay Johnson was the next new thing. Completely turned it down. Was like, what are you even doing at this point? And now I just wish. I wish I can go back for that deal. So, I mean, this is just, the season is long, but George Pickens right now is producing like a league-winning asset.
Yeah, and if you want to talk about up and down roller coaster type seasons, any Steelers wide receivers or former Steelers wide receivers, they're always going to give you that up and down sort of stuff there. So, all right, with that, let's take our first break. We come back, talk through my stats that people need to know going into week 11 right after this. All right, we're back. Let's talk through my 5 stats that the people need to know heading into week 11. We'll get to my secret stat in the 5th and final one. But first, let's start with the NFL's most efficient wide receivers the last 4 weeks in terms of team success rate per target. And I just kind of want you to react to any of the names we don't expect to see on a list like this. Number 1 is Amon-Ra St. Brown at 76%. Number 2 is Terry McLaurin at 73.9%. I think those two, it's like, okay, I would expect that. Those guys get high yield targets. They help the team, and success rate in this standpoint is just, it's a down and distance metric. Are you helping your team move the ball on more than 66% of your targets? Terry McLaurin, Amon-Ra St. Brown, top on the list. A.D. Mitchell, number 2, 74.4% over the last 4 weeks. Devon Vele, Broncos wide receiver, is number 4, 69.2%. Then we've got 3 guys that are tied at 66.7%. DeAndre Hopkins, I think we can expect that. Jacoby Myers, who we've highlighted a lot on this show, you have at least. And then Romeo Doubs coming off the bye week at 66.7%. So, like I said, I think we expect St. Brown, McLaurin, Hopkins, even Myers because of the usage he's gotten. But some of these other names, any sort of staying power, any signal in terms of guys like Mitchell, I don't know, Vele or Romeo Doubs on this list?
Yeah, I'll actually start with Romeo Doubs because I do think he's sort of like a sneaky buy or a guy who's on way too many waiver wires right now for being a top 2 option in the Packers offense, at least recently. Jordan Love should only be getting healthier. We'll see how healthy he is this week coming out of the bye. Tough matchup against the Bears, but Romeo Doubs is out there. Romeo Doubs is a target often in the red zone for the Green Bay Packers, who are getting there often, who are throwing most weeks 35 plus times per game. So I do think that Doubs is maybe not the guy you think is efficient. So it's good to know that that's been the case over his past 4 games, over the past month of the season. But I think he is somebody that you can comfortably start as like a wide receiver 3 in those types of leagues or a flex option. So yeah, that just gives a little bit of vote of confidence there. And I also just feel secure about his role moving forward compared to the next guy I'll talk about, and that's A.D. Mitchell. A.D. Mitchell is somebody I would love to say, yeah, like I got a fantasy starter rest of season now, but we don't really know what's going on with Michael Pittman. Like it's somewhat the back, probably mostly the back. And now there was a finger injury, I believe. So he was out last week. We'll see what happens moving forward this week in practices. If he starts to miss practices again and you have A.D. Mitchell on your team, I don't think this past week was a fluke. Like, assuming Joe Flacco is going to continue to start the passing game, at least drop back wise, I think gets a little bit more of a boost there over Anthony Richardson still. But A.D. Mitchell came into week 10. He ranked 4th in average depth of target on the season amongst all players. He was just able to qualify with his target share, which was shocking to me that you said that he's been that efficient because he's seeing downfield targets primarily, and he's producing on those. This past week, he got a little bit more volume. He did produce. He caught all 6 targets, 71 yards, a couple of explosive plays, a couple of intermediate targets, not all downfield, but I think that's encouraging. Like, if he's remaining that efficient while seeing downfield usage and more playing time, like, this is all the trends that we want to see. It just really comes down to what Michael Pittman's health is. And then for Devon Bailey, he's kind of been getting hyped up since the preseason, had a nice start to the year, got banged up. So I think it is what it is for him. It's maybe a smaller sample thing right now. I think he has like 25 targets or so on the year. But for playing a limited role, 50% of the snaps in the Broncos offense, it's, you can say, encouraging for deeper leagues, but really tough to buy into it. I will say, though, he has at least 12 or more PPR points in half of his games.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's at least interesting and on the radar. And, you know, the Broncos' number 2 receiver has just moved like a lot over the year, whereas Cortland Sutton's obviously been the one. But yeah, I mean, Vele is now back to that. So we'll see if that ends up mattering at all. In terms of the guys that actually have, you know, he doesn't have a ton of targets in this span. It's really not that many. It's only 10. So, I mean, you know, it's like you said, it can certainly be a small sample size here, but it should be 10 catches, 13 targets in the span. But yeah, I like your notes on A.D. Mitchell. I will say, man, I mean, I can't remember who said it or who I saw say this, but some like Colts reporters have said that Pittman's like struggling to bend over to pick things up in the locker room. I mean, put him on IR. Enough already. Like, let's do the right thing for the player here. So yeah, Mitchell, I would be interested in. I think he at least is worth a speculative ad, but yeah, is he going to become an every week starter? We're struggling to get Josh Downs like consistent usage in this offense because of the quarterback play. So we'll see. And Romeo Doubs, yeah, the Packers are going to be, and maybe I want to have an extended conversation with Nate about this on the film room tomorrow, because the Packers are a really interesting offense coming off their bye. Hopefully Jordan Love is healthy, but with and maybe the wide receiver usage changes, but coming into the year, my thoughts on the Packers receivers was they're going to use these guys in like specific situations on specific routes and against hyper specific coverages just because they're all pretty good. Dobbs has been the guy that when they get one-on-one matchups over there, and unlike previous years where it was just deep shots, it's a lot of like in-breaking routes and slants winning against press coverage, and those looks have been efficient as the data shows. So Dobbs generally kind of gets eye rolls in the fantasy community, and people aren't that into him because of, you know, his early career yards per route run and stuff. But I like Dobbs. I think he is a good player, and that this role is pretty sticky here for him.
Yeah, and I think more importantly, Matt LaFleur likes Dobbs, and I mean, I guess you could see depending on suspension stuff, but overall likes Dobbs in this offense, and Jordan Love does as well. Like, there's no doubt about it. You could look at some first read numbers, but once they get inside the 30-yard line, and especially the red zone, Dobbs becomes more of a priority in this offense in the passing attack. So, yeah, I agree. He kind of is like an afterthought, but when I compare him to like other players rest of season, he looks decent. Like, again, not a league winner type of player, but in a top 10 offense that's going to move the ball, be efficient, get their guys in motion, use play action. Yeah, the number potentially 1 or 2 receiver, depending on the week in that offense, should be pretty appealing.
All right, so let's talk about another offense coming out of the bye, specifically the wide receivers for the Seattle Seahawks, who still on the year rank 3rd in neutral pass rate. This is a team that's thrown the ball a lot. It hasn't always been the most efficient volume, but there has been volume here. So they're coming off the bye, and I think the critical note is, what do we think about Jackson Smith and Jigba's eruption game in week 9 coming out of the bye, with DK Metcalf likely returning to this offense? So in week 9, JSN had 3 catches on 5 targets of 20-plus air yards for 99 yards. He had a 20.2 average depth of target and a 7.14 yards after catch per reception average. This is a stark difference to what he was in the first 8 weeks of the season, and really dating back to last year as well, his rookie season. In weeks 1 to 8, he had 0 catches on 5 targets of 20-plus air yards. He had 0 games with multiple deep receptions, an 8.1 average depth of target, and just 4.88 yards after catch per reception. So Sal Vetri, week 9, is it one of these, oh man, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. We saw that explosion from JSN. We, as the Seattle Seahawks coaching staff, have to get this guy more involved from a downfield intermediate route perspective, or is it just a fluke?
So I don't think it's a fluke. I think it's like the cop-out answer is somewhere in between. And I think the bye week being right after that explosion definitely helps because you have that extra week to actually analyze what happens. The big thing here is if DK Metcalf returns this week, which earlier reports seem pretty optimistic that he will, that's a guy that's going to come back into this offense and probably take a lot of that usage away, at least in terms of where Geno Smith's going to be looking downfield and probably even the route concepts on certain plays. DK Metcalf hasn't played a football game in 3 weeks, and he still leads the NFL in deep targets. He has 18 deep targets of 20 plus yards this year. And because of 2 missed games in the bye, it'll be a month since he's played, still leads the NFL in deep targets. He's 6th in explosive plays this season despite not playing in the past 3 games. So I think him coming back is just going to have to take away some of that usage. But like you mentioned, like JSN saw 5 deep targets, had 3 completions on those in that big blow up game in week 9. So even if it's something that's sort of like the middling of that, he starts to see some more of this Lockett usage, occasionally seeing some downfield usage instead of just 0 to 1 targets downfield a game. Maybe now it's 1 to 2, and that's where you can get that extra little floor, that extra explosive play to the game. And then we do have maybe some more blow up weeks moving forward because of that. So right now the average depth of target, if it was to go back down to 7 or 8, not that appealing. If it starts to take over Tyler Lockett, who's usually around like 10 or 11 in this offense the past few seasons, that's where it gets interesting. Do I know it's going to happen out of the bye? No idea. That's what I'm hoping, though, since they had that extra week to prepare and just saw what he was able to do working downfield.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be 5, and it doesn't need to be 20 air yard targets, but how about like 3 of 12 or 15 plus? I think that would just be good enough here for JSN. So I still have hope that there's more to him than what we've seen from a statistical perspective, because I think he's been fine as an NFL player. I don't think he's been bad. I think he's somebody that probably should try to maximize him a little bit more in this area. Number 3 storyline, let's do a little Chargers running back check-in, because I'm really high on this Chargers team. I think they're good. I think the offense is trending in the right direction, and I think it's worth just checking back in on J.K. Dobbins because Gus Edwards was activated off IR, and obviously, as I covered far too in depth on the Sunday recap show, we had the Hassan Haskins goal line fiasco last week as well for the Chargers. So, Chargers running back check-in. Weeks 6 to 9 with no Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins had 15.6 expected fantasy points per game, which was running back 13 in this span, according to Fantasy Points data, was on the field for 74% of the snaps, 63% carry share, 46% route participation. So in week 10, Gus Edwards comes back, and J.K. Dobbins still 67% snap share, 38.5% carry share, so a big loss there. But 65% route participation and still averaged 16.6 expected points in this game thanks to goal line work, despite the Hassan Haskins revenge game fiasco against the Titans. Meanwhile, Gus Edwards did have the 25% carry share, 25% snap share, 26% carry share, but just a 9% route participation. So J.K. Dobbins' role is still really good. I actually think he's not... is he a buy or anything? I'm not sure, but I will say the upcoming schedule is interesting for him in a couple of ways. One, we have this Bengals game this week, which is great. Obviously, I think he could be like a top 10 play at the position here in week 10. Week 11. Week 12, they get the Ravens. That's obviously a brutal run game matchup, but could be a high-scoring contest overall. We get week 13 matchup against the Falcons. That's pretty nice from a run defense perspective. Week 14 Chiefs, tough run game, but again, could be a higher scoring contest. Then week 15, we get the Bucks, and everybody does whatever they want against the Bucks. So I just like the Chargers offense overall. It's an ecosystem I want to be invested in. And J.K. Dobbins, despite the return of Gus Edwards, still looks like a priority player for them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I thought the Gus Edwards usage was a couple of just different things, or why he kind of pops up as maybe like more of a fantasy talking point this week. First off, he just played well. Like, he had 10 carries in this game, but this was by far his best game as a Charger. Gus Edwards averaged over 5 yards per carry, was barely averaging 3 yards per carry in previous weeks, comes back from the injury, and he puts Kamani Vidal as a healthy scratch, which just kind of shows how, at least now, they view Kamani Vidal versus Gus Edwards. But I don't think any of that has to do with J.K. Dobbins. I think this is more so just about Kamani Vidal. J.K. Dobbins, like you mentioned, he still sees 15 plus opportunities, most likely would have gotten that touchdown any other week if it wasn't Hassan Haskins out there this past week. So I think that Moving forward, I'm not concerned about Gus Edwards. I think it's just something new that happened. So he becomes a guy because the waivers are just dead at running back. That's all, 10 carries. All right, let's discuss. Let's talk about him. He gets a little bit of hype behind him for the most part. But Dobbins is still out there. He's still out there as well in passing down situations. Definitely way more when you compare him to Gus Edwards for rest of season stuff. So yeah, if this is like an opportunity to buy low on Dobbins, I think it's interesting. I've kind of been like up and down on Dobbins all year, but we're at the point now where every single week he's going out there and seeing 15 touches, and he continues to have these explosive runs, whether it was back in week 9, a 34-yard run that iced the game, and then he follows it off with a goal line touchdown. I think he has that role pretty secure right now around the goal line until we see otherwise moving forward. So yeah, I think Dobbins, the Gus Edwards stuff, sure, like 12, 14 plus team leagues, you can add him and stash him, but Dobbins is still the guy here.
Yeah, I like it. He is definitely still the guy and should be in every week running back 2 for you down the stretch. All right, my fourth storyline. Will Drake London get the Patrick Surtain treatment in week 11? Everybody wants to know every week when you go against the Broncos, who the hell is Pat Surtain going to be covering? So according to NFL Pro, Patrick Surtain is lined up as an outside corner on 428 snaps this year and a slot corner on just 29 of those snaps. So this is interesting because typically we think, all right, number one receiver on the opposing team, they're going to get the Patrick Surtain treatment, but this is not always the way it goes. This is why you got to look at the alignment data. Recent example of this, people were worried about Zay Flowers going into this Denver Broncos matchup. Zay Flowers stung the Broncos for 127 yards and 2 scores on 5 catches in week 9, and he lined up in the slot on 16 of 30 snaps. The Ravens do a lot to move Zay Flowers around to get him advantageous matchups. They did it to get him away from Patrick Surtain, and he ripped a couple of big plays there, which obviously made his fantasy day look incredible as the Ravens pretty much blew out the Broncos. This is important for the Falcons wide receivers because, man, the Falcons offense is the passing game is so well designed, and they do so much catering for all of these wide receivers. Everybody gets a little bit of slot work for the Atlanta Falcons. Darnell Mooney has been in the slot on 41.5% of his routes. Drake London has been in the slot on 38.7% of his routes. Kyle Pitts, 37.5%, and Ray McLeod, 46.7%. Those are all their main pass-catching dudes. Drake London, it's worth noting, has been targeted on 35.9% of his snaps from the slot, which leads the team by a lot. Typically, when he gets inside, they heavily pepper him, and we've seen it in games before. Typically, that Bucks game on Thursday night, like about a month plus ago, he was just smashing them from the slot. So I don't know, Sal. It's obviously guessing game. It's game planning, things like that. But I would say that don't just immediately assume Drake London and maybe even Darnell Mooney too just get blotted out against Pat Surtain, because this team does so much, especially with motion at the snap, like full speed getting Drake London into the slot or full speed getting Darnell Mooney coming across the formation and getting him slot reps. This coaching staff is good. They design the offense pretty well, and they are very intentional about getting their guys away from difficult matchups on the outside.
Yeah. For a lot of the reasons you just said, I don't think I'm that concerned for Drake London or even Darnell Mooney this week. London is often being put in motion, often being put into the slot. Like you said, he's having a lot of success there. But also, like, this team runs a lot of bunch formations, a lot of tight formations. Guys kind of get lost in the middle of the field. That can also help. It won't be man coverage the entire game. Even when he's on the outside, there'll be a lot of zone that he'll face. So probably, if I had to guess, he probably lines up against Surtain for like 30 to 40% of this game, gets put into the slot nearly 50% of the time, on the opposite side for maybe 10%. So when I look at the betting markets early on, Drake London's yardage line is set at 63.5. His catches are around 5 for over-unders. That's kind of where he's at every single week. Like, that's basically his numbers. Maybe in a softer matchup, he goes up to like 68 receiving yards. But the betting markets aren't concerned about the Patrick Surtain matchup this week. Maybe they know these exact stats we're talking about, but I think just in general, there's probably going to be a lot of zone coverage. But Surtain specifically can shut you down for half of a game. We saw it with Hopkins last week. In a lot of those man-to-man situations, Hopkins wasn't coming through. He's an older receiver, sure. He's mostly playing on the outside, but that's why the context matters about London going into the slot. So I have London in a lot of leagues. He's obviously a start for people, but I even think that all these stats that we just gave, is even more reason maybe in the betting markets to look at some of his player props.
Yeah, I like that call out too. The Falcons get a bye in week 12 after this matchup against the Broncos, but this is their tough defensive stretch here. Denver this week, they get the Chargers in week 13, the Vikings in week 14. So I really liked what I've seen from this offense. Obviously, they're coming off a loss that was mostly due to special teams and some other gaffes. Classic. I can't believe Kirk threw that threw the ball behind the line of scrimmage on 4th down. Unbelievable stuff to as the final pass of that game. Just classic Kirk, unfortunately. But yeah, this is the stretch of defenses that are going to test this Falcons offense that I've really enjoyed this year. Then they get some cupcakes to end the season. So we'll see what the Falcons have in store for us. All right. 5th and final stat, the secret stat here for me, Sal Vetri. This mystery running back has a pretty sweet passing down role the last 2 weeks. This running back is number 1 at the position in targets. He's number 1 in receiving first downs, so those looks have not been wasted. This team has been getting him targets, and he's been helping them move down the field. It's not just been little nonsense looks. His 0.7 average depth of target is actually the second highest among running backs with double-digit targets in this 2-week span. So it also just hasn't been a bunch of behind the line of scrimmage stuff. It's been, I would say, mostly check downs, but there's been some designed looks as well. And this running back is one of just 8 players at the position with an end zone target in the last 2 weeks. So if we're talking passing down role, receiving roles at the running back position, it doesn't get much better than high volume, efficient volume, and volume in the scoring area. So, Sal Vetri, who is this mystery running back?
I have one clarification question. When you say most targets, that's over the past 2 weeks, not the season?
Over
right?
the past 2 weeks, yes.
Okay. With that, then, I'll say Chase Brown.
It is Chase Brown. So we keep the streak
We're 100%.
alive.
We are 100%, folks.
I think. Don't fact check me on that. But this episode, we are 100%. So, yeah, I mean, Chase Brown, the receiving role has been awesome. And, I went back and watched this game against the Ravens. And you need a bit of a palate cleanse after some of the other primetime games this week. Let's go back and watch that beautiful performance from the Cincinnati Bengals, especially in that game. And they're just that matchup for him was rough from a run game perspective. We knew he wasn't going to have big time rushing usage, but the passing game usage for him was just so awesome. And specifically, like I said, Joe Burrow's getting rid of that ball to Chase Brown pretty quickly when there's nothing downfield. And obviously, Jamar Chase had a bunch of yards. He went off against the Ravens. There was plenty available downfield, but when it wasn't there, when he was pressured, Joe Burrow was very comfortable getting to Chase Brown in the passing game, which hasn't always been the case. They haven't always wanted to trust him from a pass protection standpoint, but they're making use of him as a real deal receiving weapon right now, especially, like I said, as a check down guy, just like 1 or 2 yards down the field. And he's been picking up yards after the catch and getting first downs, number 1 at the position in first downs from a pass catching standpoint the last 2 weeks. I mean, if you're going to dominate your running back rush share, which they traded for Khalil Herbert, they worked out Leonard Fournette this week, but I still think Chase Brown is probably going to command 70+% of the running back carries, and that might be conservative. And you're going to get this passing game usage. A true running back 1 rest of season run here from Chase Brown is not out of the range of outcomes.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the whole cliche league winning type running backs from the summer, a 10th or 11th round pick on Chase Brown, it's coming through in a major way right now. There's just no competition for where these high value touches are coming. I don't think they're going to take him away in the red zone. I mean, this guy had 7 red zone carries, which is also they're just not getting in. Back in week 9 against the Raiders, 7 red zone carries in that game alone. Now Khalil Herbert's on the team. I don't foresee him just all of a sudden seeing those high value touches that you have to trust the player for. Definitely won't be involved in a major way in the passing game. We'll see what happens if they bring in a Leonard Fournette. But again, I think this is just all depth pieces. Right now, Chase Brown looks great. We'll see what happens when T. Higgins comes back, if the offense changes at all, if with another target downfield, you don't have to go to your 3rd or 4th priority, which could be Chase Brown on these checkdowns if T. Higgins is winning as your second option instead of guys like Andre Yoshevich. But as of right now, feels good. When you're going out there and playing 80% of the snaps and then over 90% of the snaps in back-to-back weeks, no Zach Moss the rest of the year, wheels up for Chase Brown.
Yeah, there's this Chargers matchup in week 11 for Chase Brown. That's obviously a tough run defense. They get the bye in week 12. Steelers in week 13. I mean, a glorious matchup with the Cowboys on Monday Night Football in week 14. I mean, they should smash whatever's left of Dallas at that point. The Titans, the Browns, the Broncos, and then the Steelers again in week 18. There's some really tough defensive matchups for Cincinnati here, but this passing down role is gonna be what elevates the floor for Chase Brown. That even if he averages 3.9 yards per carry or something like that, there's not a lot of efficient runs. If he's catching 4 passes a game or something like that, he's still gonna remain in that, like I said, maybe not running back 1, but sort of around the fringes of that discussion. With that, let's take our final break. When we come back, Sal's going to give us a couple moves to make as the trade deadline is rapidly approaching here in Yahoo Public Leagues right after this. All right, we're back. Sal, you got a couple moves for the people to make. I mean, look, trade deadline's coming up. They could make a bajillion moves. They could do whatever they want. These are the two you say people need to make. I mean, need to, Sal. So let's be clear on that.
That's right.
Give us your first move that the people need to make as the trade deadline approaches.
Yeah, it might not seem like a sexy move, but trade for Ramondre Stevenson. This is somebody that not just the upcoming schedule, but really the fantasy playoff schedule, if you're somebody who feels like you're going to get there, is a reason to do so. First of all, the past month of the season, he's had one of the best roles in fantasy for a running back. Last 3 weeks, since getting healthy, by the way, before that he just wasn't healthy. I think that contributed to his role a little bit. 75% of the snaps for the Patriots, averaging 20 opportunities per game. And this past week, he kind of buried Antonio Gibson as far as a passing down role goes. He ran 5 times the amount of routes. He was out there on the long down and distance, which wasn't the case earlier in the season over Antonio Gibson. So you're getting Ramondre Stevenson, 3 down back. And now, this past week, it only got 77 scoreless yards on 21 touches. It was an inefficient day for him, sure, but it's not a sexy offense for most part of the season. It's not a sexy player to be trading for, but Drake May, the rookie quarterback, is helping that a ton. The past 2 weeks have been brutal matchups. The Bears, that's partially why there was inefficiency last week. Even the week before that against the Titans. He's kind of now out of that stretch of games. He has a quarterback who's actually sustaining drives, getting downfield, scoring touchdowns. And Stevenson's a guy who already has 4 top 12 finishes on the season, and now I only have to assume the offense will be better moving forward rest of season with Drake May, especially as the matchups against the Colts and the Cardinals in the fantasy playoffs come up. Even a winnable matchup against the Rams defensive line that has been getting better, but you can still get yours on the ground against them. So I think this is a nice spot. Like if you could trade 1-for-1, same position, we always say is weird. Kareem Hunt as like a sell high for Ramondre Stevenson before Pacheco comes back, I would. Across separate positions, if you can deal some sort of Khalil Shakur package for Ramondre Stevenson, even a Sutton, if you're strong at wide receiver and you could trade Cortland Sutton 1-for-1 for Ramondre, I'd be doing that right now. I think he has one of the best playoff schedules.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's even some bigger name wide receivers. If you're strong at wideout, that you could give up. Like I would maybe try to sell high on the JSN Week 9 game and get a Ramondre Stevenson. Like I like Ladd McConkey, but I think I'd rather have a Ramondre Stevenson. Jameson Williams, weird player, he was just suspended. But like that's the group of wideouts that I would give up to get Stevenson, because I'm with you. I think that this offense is pretty good. It's kind of, it's not pretty good, but it's pretty stable, let me say. They've settled into a nice area. Drake May has really elevated the proceedings here. And yeah, I just think Stevenson's a good player that they want to make their foundation back. And that's rest of season schedule is really nice. So yeah, I've always said I have a lot of Stevenson this year, so I'm hoping you're right, because I'd like for those teams to have a nice finish to the fantasy season. But yeah, I'm generally with you here that I think Stevenson is a pretty nice buy who people aren't like jazzed up about. So I think is someone that they could potentially make a trade offer for. All right, your next one though hurts my feelings a little bit. Sal Vetri, you say we got to sell high on this wide receiver.
Yeah, I'm trying to trade away Marvin Harrison in a couple of leagues, Marvin Harrison Jr., where I have him. He's coming off of a quality performance, 13.5 half PPR points this past week on 5 targets. He's now produced some good to great fantasy weeks in 2 out of his last 3 games. Had a 20-point performance just 3 weeks ago. So I think it's opened up a nice sell high window on the Cardinals' first round pick. If this is a similar situation to Debo, you just kind of want to test the market on these guys. You're not just selling low on them. There's a reason you want to try and sell high. If a deal's not there, don't make the deal. But over his last 5 contests, we're just getting 5 targets per game, which is nowhere near elite volume. He ranks 48th in wide receiver fantasy points per game during that time. Trey McBride is still a target hog on this team, leading the team in target share the past 2 months. And Marvin Harrison's role, like I keep watching some of the ways that they're using him, and it does get encouraging, especially the last few weeks when he's been producing, but I just want to see more. Like I want to see just more catchable targets. I want to see just more layup targets from him, especially based on the fact that you probably spent a second-round pick on this guy, and the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, he's been somewhat producing like that, but I do think it opens up the opportunity to sell because we just haven't seen the consistency all year for him and in this offense or the volume. So if I could sell same position for like George Pickens or Devonta Smith off a down week right now, I would. If you can sell for David Montgomery, if you across different positions, a James Cook type package deal, those are the deals that I'm trying to make right now to get rid of Marvin Harrison. Again, it's all based on the context of your team. If you have him on your team and you're listening to this and you just don't have any other wide receivers, of course, don't try and make that deal across different positions. But I'm testing the market on guys like Debo this week and Marvin Harrison where I can.
Yeah, I think I'd rather have George Pickens, but probably would still rather have Marvin Harrison than Devonta Smith, just because he's the number one receiver, but Trey McBride might be the number one target. I mean, it's kind of we're splitting hairs a little bit there, but yeah, I'm a little bit like on the other side of it too, just because you look at the schedule for Arizona. I mean, which is a little bit, you can go both ways with this because yeah, they have the Patriots and the Panthers in week 15 and 16. But if they're smoking those teams because they're kind of making a run towards the playoff is Arizona, are they just going to sit on the ball and run the piss out of it with James Conner and even Trey Benson now getting involved? That's always possible. I will say, there has been some changes for Marvin Harrison's route tree. He's still not getting a lot of layup looks, like you said. I mean, he gets by far the fewest layup looks of any of the rookie wide receivers right now, other than maybe Roma Dunzeg, because he's like the third target there or whatever, which whole nother conversation, my God. But doesn't get those layup looks. He's still almost exclusively lining up at X receiver, but they have cut down the overall vertical routes for him. He has been running more dig routes, out routes, things in the intermediate area. Still some lower percentage targets, no question. I would love to see more layups as well, but that's going to lead into some of the volatility. The run heavy nature overall of the Cardinals is going to lead into some volatility. And over the last, few games since week 7, he has a 26% target share, 22.8% target share, which is second on the team behind Trey McBride at 26.7%, but he leads the team in air yards. So I think that kind of speaks to some of the volatility we're talking about here with Marvin Harrison. So I don't know. I think he's going to have some big games to end the season, but he could also have plenty of these 35-yard games that people get annoyed with.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's the consistency at this point, which you can bet on it staying good. Like Kyler Murray's coming off of a great game. The offense has looked nice recently. So for me, it's about testing the market at this point. I have him as my 47th overall player rest of the season. Would be probably about a 4th round pick if we redrafted today. I'm probably lower than most people in that regard. Same position trades, like we said, are always weird. Mike Evans coming out of potentially the bye week healthy if he's back. Somebody that I would want to have, especially as you target him getting 0 points on his bye week. Maybe you can get that done. Again, don't sell low on this guy. Sell high, see what you can get tippy top in the market.
Yeah, I like that. If you're going to sell high, and I agree. I think George Pickens, Mike Evans, I'd rather have those guys at the wide receiver position rest of the way. And certainly, like a guy, a David Montgomery type if you need the running back help. But that's going to do it. Those are the moves people need to make, Sal. Like I said, need to make as the trade deadline approaches. I know you've got a bunch of other trade-based content here as things are working down. Tell the people what they can find from you on the Yahoo airwaves. With the trade deadline week at Yahoo, there's going to be a bigger article going out. By the time you're listening to this on Wednesday, it'll be about double the size as usual to just give you even more names to talk about and target in trades, trade for, trade aways. Thursday's the matchups to exploit, the best matchups on the week that you should know about. And then Friday are the key findings for the week, just a bunch of tidbits throughout the whole week that I gather and that you should know before you set your lineups in week 11. Boom. There you go.
Boom.
Make sure you're definitely checking all that out before the trade deadline comes and goes in your fantasy league. For now, that is going to do it for us today. Shout out to Sal. Some great work on this show. We will be back tomorrow with the Fantasy Film Room and Nate Tice. Like I said, we're going to do maybe some deep dive on players returning from injuries that could really help you the rest of the season. Maybe could change the complexion of the offenses that they play in. We also preview a big Thursday night football game, NFC East matchup with the Eagles and Commanders. Until then, we are out.